Hearing of the Subcommittee on Africa and Global Health will come to order, and our topic today is Zimbabwe from Crisis to Renewal. Good morning, and let me welcome all of you here today in regard to this very important hearing entitled Zimbabwe from Crisis to Renewal. This is the second hearing that I've held this year on Zimbabwe, so it is testimony to the fact that we feel that Zimbabwe is a very, very important country and that we need to focus on it to see if we can move it from its past and current situation to an improved one. And we think that it's important that we continue to debate over U.S. policy towards that country. At our last hearing, I gave a brief overview of Zimbabwe's great history because in the midst of ongoing political and economic crisis that continues to plague Zimbabwe, its past rich history is often forgotten. As we will hear from our esteemed witnesses, there is still hope for the renewal that so many seek in Zimbabwe. However, serious challenges remain. That's one of the purposes why we are still focusing on Zimbabwe. The purpose of this hearing is to explore those challenges and to discuss the ways that U.S. policy can have a positive impact. It's very easy to chastise and to sanction and to isolate. It's very difficult to try to see how we can have a transformational policy to see if we can bring a country from its doldrums into the new millennium as we speak. In September 2008, the Global Political Agreement, the GPA, was signed between the Zimbabwean African National Union Patriotic Front, ZANU-PF, led by President Robert Mugabe, the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC, led by Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai, and the Movement for Democratic Change, Mutambra, MDCM. And a coalition government was formed. Since then, important progress has been made, yet serious challenges remain and the people of Zimbabwe continue to suffer. Due to the difficult economic and security conditions, an estimated 3 million people fled Zimbabwe for South Africa, and unemployment rates have reached over 90%. Civil society groups, labor unions, and other economic groups continue to face harassment and intimidation from ZANU-PF-ruled security forces. We are now 2 years since the GPA was signed. In Zimbabwe, as we have seen in other countries, most strikingly in Sudan, whose own CPA, Comprehensive Peace Agreement, is in danger of failure, agreements do not of themselves bring peace. The agreement is merely the foundation upon which a peace and a process of change can be built. It's a framework, and we tend to want to hope that the framework will work. But as we have seen, it's difficult and in many times unattainable. In the case of the GPA, many see it as having already failed because ZANU-PF still controls much of the power in the coalition government. However, I believe that there are elements within the coalition government, not just in the opposition, who want to see real change in Zimbabwe and with whom we can work to improve the lives of everyday Zimbabweans. The new government has faced formidable challenges in responding to widespread humanitarian needs, including addressing a serious cholera outbreak in 2008-2009 that claimed more than 4,000 lives, and in implementing the reforms necessary to repair a badly damaged economy. Despite odds that seem stacked against progress, improvements have been made in several sectors by the new government ministers from MDC, particularly the economic reforms by Finance Minister Tendai Biti. Present what many Zimbabweans and international communities, myself included, believe is an opportunity to push for political reform and economic recovery. Proof of the growing sense that Zimbabwe is slowly moving in the right direction is the recent establishment of the Enterprise Zimbabwe, founded by Sir Richard Branson. Pam Olmadeer, of Humanity United and Nduna Foundation, which seeks to attract investments towards Zimbabwe's economic and social recovery. Although I remain concerned about the harassment of opposition and civil society activists by ZANU-PF elements, the human rights situation has improved, though modestly. I had the opportunity to meet with President Mugabe in the spring of 2009, the first meeting of a U.S. official in several years, and it lasted for several hours. And I shared with him my concern over the lack of implementation of the GPA and the continued harassment of human rights groups like Women of Zimbabwe, Arise, WOZA, and opposition activists. And we had a very thorough discussion about that, where he was ready to deny that it was perpetrated by his government, but that these were things that happened. And we did see a downturn in the attack on the women immediately following our meetings. However, we have seen problems arise again. Despite the economic turnabout begun by Minister Bitai, the majority of Zimbabweans face enormous challenges and live on less than $1 a day. Other challenges that remain include the approval of a new constitution that reflects the will of the people and the security sector reform, which is extremely important. As I have previously stated, the method of redistribution of land from white landowners to political allies of President Mugabe was misguided and wrong. However, the land issue is a real problem in the region, and I am committed to seeing a just and equitable distribution of land throughout Southern Africa, consistent with the rule of law. We can't say that the problem does not exist. However, a solution to the problem has to be in an equitable way. I am also concerned about the impact that the indigenization law enacted earlier this year, which requires all firms to have majority black shareholders, will have on the ability to attract investment. These are things which I would like to continue to engage President Mugabe on in a constructive way. The injustices left behind with the legacy of colonialism must be seriously addressed. They do not go away. However, it may be a more constructive way to look at other models for redressing these wrongs, such as the Black Economic Empowerment Program in South Africa. Let me again state that this is a serious issue that must be addressed. Again, I believe Zimbabwe is at a critical juncture, which requires real leadership from the U.S. to engage other donors in the renewal of Zimbabwe's political, economic, and social structure. Currently, U.S. policy cannot take full advantage of the changing realities in Zimbabwe because of restrictions on assistance in certain key areas. I believe with greater flexibility, the administration would be able to do just that. To that end, earlier this year, I introduced the Zimbabwe Renewal Act, H.R. 5971, which would provide the following: 1, cancellation of Zimbabwe's debt, support for full implementation of the GPA, assistance for democratic and judicial reform, economic recovery, human rights, labor rights, press freedom, health care, education, clean water, agriculture, and youth employment, support for land reform, technical assistance to key ministries, maintain sanctions where needed, and call for a review and removal of certain sanctions if certain conditions are met to support the GPA and the economic, social, and democratic renewal of Zimbabwe. I hope that moving forward, this bill will receive wider support of this committee towards working for a better chance for all people in Zimbabwe. We have an excellent panel of witnesses today. Although the panel is made up of all men, we invited 4 different women. My women's staff wanted me to make sure that I mention this, and with Pearl Alice staring, I wanted to be sure that I mentioned it. We invited women from the Humanity United, Nduna Foundation, Enterprise Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe Peace Project. and unfortunately, none of them could make it today. The experts we have today, though, although they're not women, that's clear, I think that they will all do an excellent job. So with that, I'll recognize our ranking member, Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this very important hearing, and welcome to our witnesses. We are all familiar with the sad reports from Zimbabwe, recently known as the world's fastest shrinking economy. Before Robert Mugabe, Zimbabwe dictator president, agreed to a power sharing with the Movement for Democratic Change in 2009, prices were known to double every 24 hours, and for 2008, the IMF reported inflation at 500 billion% and economic growth at negative 14%. Though MDC reforms seem to have broken the hyperinflation, the situation is extremely difficult, with massive unemployment and immigration and broken systems of health care and education. It is difficult to even grasp the tragedy lived by millions of Zimbabweans. Until 10 or 15 years ago, they lived in one of the most prosperous African countries. Perhaps the most human measure of the suffering caused by economic failure is the decline in life expectancy, which fell from 56 years in 1990 to 44 years in 2008. In the past 2 years, it has risen slightly to 47.5. These numbers reflect millions of families without moms and dads, and probably even more mothers and fathers who have lost their children. This is not the result of accidental misrule or weak government in chaotic conditions, but of Mugabe's ruthless pursuit of total control. He is a declared admirer of the North Korean Juche system. According to the Heritage Foundation, the Index of Economic Freedom in 2009, Zimbabwe ranked 178th, right behind Cuba and right in front of, last place, North Korea. His violent harassment of the opposition, human rights activists, and journalists includes torture and death. But Mugabe and his ZANU-PF party were not able to achieve the same control over Zimbabwe as the Kim family has over North Korea. Zimbabwean civil society and human rights activists, including the men and women of the Movement for Democratic Change, have heroically organized themselves in opposition to Mugabe. For years, they have understood that the only way forward for Zimbabwe is to throw off Mugabe and the criminal elements of ZANU. After Mugabe's attempt to steal the 2008 election failed, we all hoped that the power-sharing agreements that Mugabe was forced to accept with the Movement for Democratic Change and Morgan Tsvangirai would create a new situation. We hope Mugabe and ZANU-PF security chiefs would have to loosen their choking grip on that country. Unfortunately, this has not happened, nor is there any sign that, despite the admirable and often heroic efforts of the MDC, that it will happen any time in the foreseeable future. Mugabe and his lieutenants have managed to keep control over the key levers of power to limit the MDC ministers' real authority, often by ignoring them, and to frustrate the purposes of the agreement. And so now we are back before questions of how U.S. policy can encourage change in Zimbabwe, whether current sanctions on Zimbabwe should be retargeted, and how humanitarian aid might likewise be restructured. I want to note for the record that we are joined at our hearing by Jeff Flake, a member of this committee, obviously. But Jeff Flake actually lived in Zimbabwe between 1982 and 83, and he actually wrote his master's thesis on Robert Mugabe. So we have a man that who has been following this for virtually all of his adult life, and it's great to have him here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership as well.
Thank you very much. Congresswoman Woolsey, do you have an opening statement?
A very short one, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. And Zimbabwe, I believe, could have been one of the great post-colonial nations in Africa. Instead, President Mugabe plundered his own country, laid waste to a profitable economy, a strong education sector, and a dynamic population. And the proud and strong people of Zimbabwe deserve so much better. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today and learning if and how our foreign aid assistance is helping to elevate Zimbabwe back to its rightful place as a regional leader in Southern Africa. So thank you for this hearing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Flake? Okay, thank you. We will now move into our witnesses' testimony, and let me introduce the four gentlemen before us. We have with us first, we'll hear from Mr. Steve McDonald. Mr. McDonald is the consulting director of the Africa Program and the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C., where he has worked since 2002. Mr. McDonald helped to design, initiate, and now manages the center's leadership capacity building and post-conflict resolution program in Burundi, the DRC, and Liberia. Ms. McDonald has a master's degree in African policies from the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, and has lived on and worked with Africa for over 40 years. Mr. McDonald began his career in Africa in 1970 as an embassy officer in the U.S. Embassy in Kampala, Uganda, and later served in South Africa as the desk office for Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, and Sao Tome and Principe. During these years, he served as support staff to the Anglo-American Initiative on Rhodesia that led to the Lancaster House and the Zimbabwean settlement and the five-power negotiations on Southwest Africa, Namibia. In 1980, Mr. McDonald moved to the nonprofit sector, where he has headed the U.S. South African Leadership Development Program, African Institute Southern Africa Policy Forum, and was one of those responsible for bringing Mr. de Klerk together with Mr. Mandela for their first face-to-face meeting under the Aspen Institute, a meeting I happened to have the privilege to be at in the apartheid following the release of Mr. Mandela while Mr. de Klerk was still president. He has served as executive vice president of the African American Institute. He's also done conflict resolution work in Northern Ireland and Brazil. Mr. McDonald has published, edited, and written for numerous publications. Next, we have Mr. Sidney Musamvu. Mr. Musamvu is a senior political analyst at the Institute for Democracy in Africa, IDASA. Mr. Musamvu works on Zimbabwean issues with the IDASA State in Transition Observatory. IDASA States in Transition Observatory provides information and analysis on political development in countries experiencing a transition or crisis. Mr. Musamvu is a journalist by trade. In addition to his work for IDASA, Mr. Musamvu has researched and written on Zimbabwe for the past 7 years with Brussels-based International Crisis Group and consulted with the Elders Forum on Zimbabwe. Next, we have Mr. DeRose Muchina. Mr. Muchina is Deputy Director and Economic Justice Program Manager at the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. Prior to these appointments, Mr. Muchina worked with USAID and the Zimbabwe Mission as Democracy and Governance Advisor. Mr. Muchina is a highly respected human rights defender in Zimbabwe, having been among the founding members of the National Constitutional Assembly and continuing to serve on boards of various NGOs. Earlier in his career, Mr. Muchina was at the Zimbabwe Council of Churches, focusing on economic and social rights and the role of the church in promoting and protecting fundamental freedoms and civil liberties. Finally, we have Dr. Marian L. Tupi. Dr. Tupi is a policy analyst with the Cato Institute Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity, specializing in the study of political economy of Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Tupi has worked on the Council on Foreign Relations, Commission on Angola, and advised the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. Department of State on Central Europe. Dr. Tupi received his BA in International Relations and Classics from the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. South Africa, and his Ph.D. in International Relations from the University of St. Andrews in Great Britain. Dr. Tupi's articles have been published in a number of outlets, both in the United States and overseas. He has appeared on various television programs in the United States and throughout the world. We welcome this panel. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your kind introduction. Congressman Smith, Congressman Woolsey, Congressman Flake, it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to appear before you. I have had the honor of working with the distinguished Chairman Donald Payne before, over the last 20 years or so, as a matter of fact. He's made allusion to that. And it's really a delight to be here again and working with him. The challenge that lies before us today reminds me a little bit of the work we did in the 1980s on South Africa, where we're dealing with a regime that needed to have some sanctions taken against it, needed to have a strong push to change the way in which things were unfolding there, but at the same time needed to protect the people, needed to work in a positive way to ensure a democratic future. And I think that's a challenge that lies before us today. I want to begin my oral testimony with a caveat about myself. I appreciate the introduction, and all I was involved very intimately and very early on in 1976 to 1980 with the transition from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe. I have, as a U.S. diplomat, and I've worked in subsequent years with that country in various other capacities, but I haven't visited Zimbabwe in 10 years. And while I stay in close touch with the colleagues who do visit and with Zimbabwean friends, both in and outside of the country, my reflections on the current situation are of necessity secondhand. Therefore, having had a good look at the scope and depth of the testimony that you're about to hear from my colleagues here at the table with me, who are going to describe in detail the current state of play and the fragility of the global political agreement, the GPA, and the transitional inclusive government, and the human rights abuses and the economic situation that besets that country, I think my best focus would be on some aspects of what the U.S. can most usefully do to make a difference in encouraging the renewal of Zimbabwe that we all seek. In my submitted testimony, written testimony, I elaborate on the record of abuse of ZANU-PF through the years from 1980 to 2008. And I talk about the early optimism that I think you referred to, Mr. Chairman, from the international community and Congresswoman Woolsey too, and the disappointment now that exists over the human rights abuses, the abrogation of democratic norms, the corruption and mismanagement that has occurred in subsequent years. In response, of course, as we well know, and as detailed in your opening remarks, the international community has responded with an application of a number of sanctions against government officials, a redirecting of development aid through non-governmental channels, statements of strong condemnation of human rights abuses, encouragement of the regional and SADC and Africa Union peace initiatives, support for the GPA, a new constitution, and free and fair elections, but a strong cooling of our bilateral relations. Although the implementation of the GPA has been painfully slow, the very fact that it exists, that the opposition party, the MDC, holds the Prime Minister's office and other significant ministries, mostly focused on the economy and development, has given outside observers some room for optimism. With signs of recovery in the economy now, continuing promises of cooperation amongst the parties to the coalition government to push through the actions called for by the GPA, and a new government in South Africa, and dynamics within SADC that indicate the end of a tolerance for the Mugabe regime, legislation has now been offered in both the House and the Senate that would seek to continue to apply pressure to this wayward regime and to the individuals who have not committed to the GPA, while at the same time not exacerbating the damage to the fabric of the economy and the welfare of the people of Zimbabwe. And more important, looking to the future, fashioning a way to support a viable opposition and encourage a return to democratic governance. I would caution policymakers as they look at possible policy options to be certain there are some sticks along with the carrots, that monitoring of performance on democracy and recovery be strict and comprehensive, and that they do not allow the government to use any lifting of sanctions, however targeted and whatever caveats are applied, as a propaganda victory. I know my colleagues here will offer some concrete suggestions in their testimony on how U.S. policy and engagement might be shaped in the coming years. Legislation offered by this body and your colleagues in the Senate offer a number of possible avenues for positively impacting the transition. Let me add only one thing, one further thought on one specific aspect of the renewal that has to come, and I believe is coming. Based on my own experiences in other conflict and post-conflict countries in Africa, as well as conversations I've had with Zimbabweans currently engaged in pushing for recovery there, I would like to underline an important and often overlooked element in dealing with conflicted societies. Any country emerging from conflict has several common imperatives. They are intuitive, but almost always ignored. Trust has been broken, and the antagonists to the conflict do not have a sense of interdependence or shared interests. Relationships are torn asunder. Communications are characterized by posturing and accusations. The key stakeholders do not listen to each other, and discourse is confrontational. Finally, there is no agreement on how power is to be shared and decisions made. In short, there is no common vision and sense of common identity. There are tried and tested ways in which antagonists can be brought together to address these issues, rebuild the trust, and form collaborative relations that allow them to solve problems together and move forward while still taking into account the interests of all. Sometimes this approach is listed as reconciliation or conflict resolution, but is really conflict transformation, changing the way in which people compete, how they think about and interact with each other. At a level where insidious and self-serving interests seem dominant, where the outside world sees no political will from the opposing parties to reach out to each other, this job, of course, can be very, very difficult. But my program at the Woodrow Wilson Center, as the chairman has mentioned, has been pioneering this methodology for over 8 years in Burundi and the DRC and Liberia, with increasing levels of success and the formation of networks of committed leaders to work together for a common future. These are ideas that I have explored with colleagues at IDASA and IDASIM, who are at the table here today, in Johannesburg, and Search for Common Ground here in Washington and in Harare. And we're exploring how best we might be able to use, or insist in the transition as the renewal of Zimbabwe begins to take place. The points of entry will differ from programs we've done elsewhere, and one might have to start at a local or community level. Civil society, along with political power brokers, must be involved. But it must be a part of any renewal effort, in tandem with or even in preceding the setting in place of institutional frameworks and processes such as elections. Without trust, without a shared vision, without a sense of interdependence and a willingness to collaborate, the agendas of democratic governance, development, reconciliation, and recovery cannot go forward. I am pleased to see that bills now under consideration address this element by providing support for reconciliation efforts, strengthening local government, and encouraging peace-building process. I hope this remains central to any role that the United States decides to play. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Willing to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Masumva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee for inviting me and my organization, which I look forward to testify to this committee. Mr. Chairman, it is an honor for me to talk about Zimbabwe from crisis to renewal. But I want to state from the onset that Zimbabwe faces a critical 6 months. The honeymoon, which has been enjoyed over the past 18 months as a result of the formation of the inclusive government, which brought some semblance of stability and peace, is about to end. In coming to the new year, Zimbabwe will recall into an election mode. And I believe before we even look forward to the renewal of Zimbabwe, we need, in the US, along with other actors, need actually to be on top of the situation and try actually to influence events in the next 6 months, which have the capacity to bring Zimbabwe back to the dark period of March 2008. Two critical elements are looming large with regards to the situation unfolding in Zimbabwe in the next 6 months. The election process and the key role of the military in that particular election. I think, Mr. Chairman, it is important to note that the issue in Zimbabwe is no longer about the credibility of elections or the perceived outcome of the elections. The critical issue in Zimbabwe is about the power transfer. And it is important right now that any policy, any intervention in Zimbabwe has to smoothen the key elements which undercut or which undermine the voice of the people, which they've done, which they've spoken to over the past 10 years. Any process or any legislation which can be pushed from wherever source, which marginalizes the key role played by, underlooks the key role played by the military in the region of the Zimbabwe crisis, will actually achieve nothing to push the transition forward and return the country to democracy. The same military is the one which actually for the past 18 months has actually been dictating the course of events in the inclusive government. All the issues which have sort of the dysfunctionality of the inclusive government has been largely being undermined by the key role played by the military, which behind the scenes is the one which is playing a key role of driving the levers of power in Zimbabwe. So as we move forward, I think the immediate objective in the next 6 months, before we even talk of renewal, is actually to influence the issue of the election process and try to structure a transition process which takes on board the concerns of the military, which by extension is taking on board the concerns of President Robert Mugabe. Over the past 8 years, it has been quite clear that the restrictive measures which have been put in place have failed to a very large extent to achieve the objective which we are set out to do. The restrictive measures were put in place to encourage the return of Zimbabwe to the rule of law, to promote good governance, and actually to encourage those undermining democracy in Zimbabwe to change course. But alas, 8 years down the line, those measures have not achieved the set out objectives. And we believe going forward, it is actually important that the restrictive measures were put in place because of a flawed election. And the upcoming election, whenever it is held, should actually set out the platform in which the whole issue of restrictive measures should be reviewed within the context of an election process. It is our considered view that unless the US, working through the AU, SADC, and with South Africa, the US should actually take a leading role in actually bringing together the key elements within the region and on the continent to actually smoothen the transition process in Zimbabwe and broaden the platform, not only looking at restrictive measures, but also looking at the role, the concerns, fears of the military establishment, which is actually key in smoothening the transition process in Zimbabwe. If those issues are not addressed, critically the issues which affect the military, I think it will be premature for us even to talk of Zimbabwe renewal before we talk of actually influencing the key elements which actually stand in the way of democratization. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Muchina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and honorable members of the committee. I appear before you as a very patriotic Zimbabwean who is part of a post-colonial generation in Zimbabwe, but trying very hard to have a role to play in the progress of our country. I want to underscore the points already made by Mr. Masamvu, which is to say the next 6 months represents a critical crossroads for Zimbabwe, because what we have seen is the return of election talk without implementing fully the requirements of the global political agreement, which would allow a credible election to take place and transfer of power to take place and a legitimate democratic government to become the product of that. That has always been the purpose of the GPA, to facilitate the transition of Zimbabwe from crisis to renewal. 4 critical goals of the global political agreement are overdue for delivery. The first is a new constitution approved through a popular vote. The second is a free and fair media environment. The third is a reformed electoral systems with a clean voters roll that doesn't have ghost voters on it. The fourth and last is an agreed upon package of security sector reforms that would facilitate non-interference of the military in the conduct and running of elections. These four things have not been delivered. They've therefore undermined progress that had been hitherto achieved on the economy since the inauguration of the inclusive government. Last week, on the 25th of November, on Thursday, the Minister of Finance submitted a budget to Parliament for 2011. The total budget is $2.6 billion. And of that, 82% of that budget is going to go towards financing recurrent expenditure, and only 18% is going to be for capital investment. That represents a precarious position on the part of Zimbabwe. And if you mirror that against a national debt of 6.7 billion, then you can see that Zimbabwe needs to pass a similar budget for the next 3 years to finance the debt. And it has become the albatross around the Zimbabwe's neck. So limited political movement and reforms is beginning to undermine economic progress. And the inability of the government to finance the debt is creating mutually reinforcing political and economic crisis. In view of this, as more fully appears in my statement, I think that there are about 4 things that we need to be supporting. It is time, in my view, for leadership and not necessarily legislation, because post-election, then that's when you can actually provide legislation that responds and reward or punish. The US government would need to renew its leadership role in dialogue with SADC. It is the African Union Sharm el-Sheikh resolution that resulted in the GPA coming into place. We need to bring the AU back into the fold, ensure that there is a special envoy working with SADC to ensure that progress is made. We need the US government to really encourage much more robust audit of what has happened to date. We also need the US government to freeze the legislative process and use its diplomatic muscle to ensure that the 2 submissions I'm making are achieved. The final part, because of elections that are coming in the absence of freedom and even in the absence of funding, we need to establish, or the establishment of a Zimbabwe Election Fund, which is managed by the UN, that ensures that the Zimbabwe Election Commission is ready to carry out elections. Last week, the budget statement did not make available resources for running the elections. It only said there should be an election fund. So it will create serious problems if we talk about elections without supporting the resolution of those elections and financing. Last one really is a much more sharper focus on the role the military has played in Zimbabwe. It is important to re-energize the focus of SADC and the AU so that the military can move away from the premise of supporting regime security towards supporting human security and development. We have no role in modern democracies for the military to leave the barracks and begin to be involved in processes of election management or even governance. I think I'm prepared to take any questions as appears more fully from my statement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tupi.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to give my testimony on Zimbabwe from crisis to renewal. The power-sharing global political agreement of 2008 was meant to return Zimbabwe on a path to democracy and economic prosperity. It was, however, a very flawed document that ignored the expressed will of the Zimbabwean people. It left the military and the Department of Justice in the hands of the ZANU-PF. Crucially, as it turned out over the past 2 years, it left the ZANU-PF also the control of the Ministry of Mines. The mining ministry is essentially an offshoot of the Zimbabwean military. Over the past 2 years, it has been awarding mining concessions for exploration of Zimbabwe's natural resources, including diamonds and gold, to a number of South African, Chinese, and Russian state-controlled or government-linked corporations. Parts of the proceeds from those mining operations are then channeled back to the Zimbabwean military and the ZANU-PF. Reports indicate that laborers from Zimbabwean mines include Chinese and Zimbabwean prisoners. The sharing of the proceeds from mining exploration with the military, but not with the rest of the population, suggests that Mugabe and ZANU-PF are trying to buy the loyalty of the armed forces to order a crackdown on the opposition in the future. To sum up, the GPA did not represent a transfer of power to the democratic forces. It is therefore unsurprising that the ZANU-PF has essentially blocked progress on reforms that are vital if electoral reform, or rather democratic transition, is to take place. Among the measures blocked by the ZANU-PF are the drafting and adoption of the new constitution, liberalization of the media, reform of the electoral system, and depoliticization of the military and the police force. It is my belief that the uneasy truce between the two parties will unravel as soon as ZANU-PF decides that the benefits of eliminating the MDC outweigh the costs of terminating the remnants of the GPA. So where do we go from here? First of all, it is the responsibility of the Zimbabwean people to chart their own course. There are clear limits to what the United States government and well-meaning Americans can do. Here are some of the measures that I believe the United States government can do. The continuation of targeted sanctions against persons and companies responsible for perpetuation of violence and economic mismanagement in Zimbabwe. Spearheading of international effort to further isolate Mugabe and ZANU-PF, which could include intensive pressure on governments in the region to resolve the issue of Zimbabwe in favor of democracy and economic growth. Ban of the exports of blood diamonds from Zimbabwe under the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme. Lastly, continuation and preferably expansion of the Voice of America radio coverage to Zimbabwe. Most Zimbabweans rely on radio for news. Speaking to one of the senior opposition leaders in Zimbabwe, I have learned that the VOA is the only truthful voice coming to Zimbabwe. In every village, people listen to the radio. Unfortunately, the VOA broadcast only lasts for an hour a day. I find it absolutely astonishing that 10 years after Zimbabwe embarked on its road to ruin, the VOA broadcasts are that short. Having grown up behind the Iron Curtain, I can personally attest to the power of truthful information in undermining tyrannical regimes. The role of the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in the collapse of communism was, I believe, absolutely vital. The US government has often expressed its willingness to step up its financial aid to Zimbabwe. And yet I believe that the US government can help the people of Zimbabwe in a much more effective and efficient way by enabling more Zimbabweans to access truthful information on a more frequent basis. Let the people make up their minds about the course of action they want to take to improve their lot. I believe that the following actions should be avoided. Provision of foreign aid to the government of Zimbabwe either now or in the event of the government falling into the hands of the MBC. Experience shows that aid is a disincentive to reform. Without recourse to aid, the government of Zimbabwe has already taken some very important steps that could generate growth in the economy. Among that is the legalization of possession and trade in foreign currencies and partial liberalization of the business environment. These positive reforms have been offset by the threat of renewal political violence, uncertainty surrounding property rights, and indigenization policy that was already discussed. Far from stimulating development in Africa, aid has retarded it. I see no indication whatsoever that foreign aid to Zimbabwe would unleash economic growth. Quite the contrary, it would likely slow it. In the past, aid to Africa has been, by and large, stolen or wasted. There is no surer way to corrupt a few remaining honest politicians and civil servants in Zimbabwe than to entice them into dishonest behavior with large sums of foreign money. A number of respected commentators in the United States and elsewhere have called on the United States and Western governments to support the MDC's health and education departments. In addition to satisfying the understandable humanitarian impulse, the argument goes, Western aid could help the MDC accomplish concrete goals and improve the welfare of the Zimbabwean people, thus showing the difference between self-interested ZANU-PF and the MDC. I believe that this point would be much more serious if there was a likelihood of a democratic transfer of power. That I do not see as very likely. Still, should the United States decide to increase aid to education and health departments in Zimbabwe, such aid should be accompanied by highest degree of scrutiny. In my view, it should be ultimately overseen by American officials seconded to health and education departments in Zimbabwe. In order to prosper, Zimbabwe needs to adopt the economic policies that enabled Hong Kong, Singapore, Chile, and South Korea and Taiwan, and many other previously poor countries to rise from poverty to riches. in the space of 1 or 2 generations. I believe that with liberalized trade and domestic business environment, with a reformed judiciary that puts emphasis on the sanctity of persons and property, Zimbabwe can prosper as many countries have done in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by asking you, I think it was you, Mr. Wachino, you mentioned that you felt that in addition to the SADC, that the AU should be involved. Can you give me your feeling of the effectiveness of SADC under Thabo Mbeki's leadership as President of South Africa, now with President Jacob Zuma leading South Africa, and therefore SADC indirectly, and why you're feeling that it should be expanded to the overall Africa Union?
Thank you, Chairman. The role of Thabo Mbeki as mediator had its successes and failures, but one of the most outstanding things about Thabo Mbeki's role was the total contempt that he held Zimbabweans, especially the opposition groups in Zimbabwe, and his overwhelming commitment in his role to save a decaying nationalist movement and impose his own will, looking at Zimbabwe through the lens of domestic political affairs in South Africa. So what he did most was to ensure that no progress would go forward that would essentially correspond with the will of the people. And I think that is the hallmark of the Mbeki's role. He also sidestepped many of the people in SADC and ensured that Zimbabwe was his personal project, and called in the African Union when and as when he wanted it to come. But you will see that it was the African Union, driven in part by Article 4 of the Constitutive Act of the African Union, which is the responsibility to protect doctrine, that they moved a motion at Sharm el-Sheikh to become involved in Zimbabwe and support SADC and guarantee the success of the GPA process. And since then, President Zuma has moved to take on the facilitation role, reporting to AU leaders from time to time. We think that the energy that was displayed by President Zuma in the initial months are beginning to falter, and he needs a shot in the arm. And the shot in the arm can come nowhere else than within the African Union itself, which is meeting, as you know, in February next year, and putting the matter on the agenda of the African Union so that it receives a report as a guarantor of the global political agreement would enable movement in Zimbabwe. President Mugabe is not afraid of everyone, of anyone in the world, except fear of losing African support. And I think that is exactly what happened when the Sharm el-Sheikh resolution was made. He discovered that he was now standing alone, and he went back and started to talk to opposition groups. It is time for the African Union to support the initiative of the SADC process by appointing a special envoy themselves, who is going to engage directly with members of the parties, but also with other people who are influencing the GPA, such as the military. And we think that if that is done, there is a reasonable prospect that the United States and other actors can now support that process, which is African-led and Zimbabwean-led. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. McDonald, you've heard that mention the Zimbabweans that the next 6 months is going to be very critical. As an Africanist and have worked in conflict and in areas where elections were coming, like in Namibia we've had, and South Africa and so forth, what would be 4 or 5 concrete steps you think that the U.S. should try to get support for?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I alluded to this in my opening remarks, what I think should be done in a pre-election period. There's a variety of things, obviously. And I note contained in the legislation that you've proposed and I think some of the sister legislation on the other side addresses some of this. But I think, tend to make mistakes as we approach elections and democratic processes in Africa, we in the Western world, by assuming if we support institutional structures and give resources to that, give training towards that, that will solve the problem. It's important to work as we can with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, to work with local monitoring groups, with training and et cetera, vastly important. And also work with party structures themselves, the MDC and the other parties, to help in their ability to campaign freely and fairly and understand competition does not mean violence. But there really needs to be preparation work done with individuals themselves. And I think that Mr. Musamvu here has put, I believe Mr. Muchena mentioned it as well, but put his finger on a very, very important aspect, and that's security sector reform. Security sector reform is writ large. I mean, we all understand, or it's rumored that the Army has played a very ominous role in the current situation in Zimbabwe, that they have been the power behind the throne, so to speak, and may have even prevented Mugabe at one point in time in 2008 of making certain compromises with opposition that he might have wanted to make, because their own interests were not being served by that. Without some work with the military in advance. And by this I mean addressing the kinds of fears that they have, that Mr. Musamvu pointed out. It's something we never think about, that why are elements within society like a military totally intractable? We dealt with this with the Tutsi-led army in Burundi. Why are they so intractable to change? It's because they are fearful of change. They're fearful of what role they will play in a coming. It's not just the loss of privilege and the loss of position and the loss of access to mineral wealth and that sort of thing. It's what will become of them. There's some real, truthfully, work that needs to be done in the true sense of conflict resolution and transformation with all of these elements. It's a big thing to try to do in a short amount of time when elections are on the horizon, and we find ourselves repeatedly in this position where that preparations for elections should have started years before, and we're now a few months before them, and we're beginning to think about it. But I think we need to think about that people factor, working not just with the parties, but with the military as well, with the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, obviously putting in training and funds for training and working with local observers and monitors, and bringing in as we can and be helpful with the bringing in of credible outside monitors.
Thank you. My time's expiring, but let me just ask you, Mr. Musimba, what authority do you really feel that Prime Minister Tsvangirai has? Has his involvement as Prime Minister made much of a change in the activities? Are they better, or are Zimbabweans better off today than they were before the MDC coalition GPA?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the greatest thing which happened in Zimbabwe was for the leadership of the opposition to agree to go into the inclusive government, taking cognizance of the suffering which the general population was experiencing at the time. I must hasten to point out that, Mr. Chairman, if Zimbabwe had gone for a further 2 or 3 months without an inclusive government in place, no matter how flawed the GPA was, actually it saved the country from erupting into civil strife. So by and large, the relative stability, peace, and somehow recovery which is being experienced in Zimbabwe right now is credited to the entry of Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai in government, notwithstanding that maybe the stakes or the balance of power is tilted against him. So to a very large extent, right now, the feeling on the ground, I was in Zimbabwe just about 2 weeks ago. When you ask the average general person, across the political divide, no one is in the mood of having an election. People are saying, let this peace which we've been experiencing for the past 18 months proceed for some time. And they are all saying the opposition, actually Prime Minister Morgan Tsvangirai, took a responsible decision by joining in the inclusive government to allow people to pick up the pieces and sort of regroup and have peace in their lives.
Thank you very much. And finally, Dr. Tupi, as you concluded your remarks about the waste and corruption and greedy politicians and bureaucrats you mentioned in Africa, therefore you are opposed to foreign aid. What's your opinion on Afghanistan and Iran? Are you opposed to Iraq and Afghanistan? The hundreds of millions, or probably billions of dollars that we are sending over there in planes and cash. Is your position that you are opposed to criminal leaders in all countries? I know we just asked you about Zimbabwe, but what is your view to what the U.S. government has been doing for the last 10 years in Iraq and in Afghanistan?
Thank you. Yes, sir, my position is consistent. I do not believe that the United States should provide foreign aid, economic development aid, to countries abroad, not simply because it is often stolen and wasted in the way that we see on a daily basis in Afghanistan, Iraq, and elsewhere, but fundamentally because it is a disincentive to reform. Countries that receive large chunks of foreign aid, governments that receive large chunks of foreign aid generally tend to be much less open to reforms, much less eager to build up their own private sector than countries that do not receive foreign aid.
Okay, just maybe one quick question. You recall the Marshall Plan? You sound like you might be from Europe. The Marshall Plan actually, if it was not for foreign assistance in the United States Marshall Plan, Europe probably would have taken another 30 or 40 years before it recovered. There was an enormous amount of U.S. taxpayers' money that went into the development of Europe. And how do you see that being different than assisting countries today?
Yes, sir. That is an excellent question. I see.
And make it quick so my colleagues can go. I'm sorry, I didn't know they were gonna. I don't know what's going on, but go ahead. 4
fundamental differences. One, the absolute amount of money involved in Marshall Plan was significantly smaller than the amount of money that the United States alone, let alone the entire Western community, have given to Africa over the past 40 years. Secondly, it was time limited to 4 years. We have now been giving foreign aid to Africa and many other countries around the world for 40 years. Thirdly, in Europe, Marshall Plan was reconstructing economies, not developing economies. Europe was already a developed continent when money was provided by the United States to reconstruct it, not to develop it from the scratch. This is a very important difference between reconstruction and development. We know how to reconstruct, we don't know how to develop.
Okay, unfortunately, my time is expired. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll ask all my questions all at once, just so that we can get to Mr. Flake as well. And any of you who would like to answer the questions, please do so. First of all, on...
And we'll have about 20 minutes or so, 25, yeah.
First, on the issue of human trafficking, which is an issue that I and so many others deeply care about. Zimbabwe is a Tier 3 country. It's an egregious violator when it comes to the government not meeting minimum standards, and that is as issued just as recently as last June by the Office of Trafficking in Persons within the administration. And in reading the report, it is a scathing indictment that, for example, orphans without birth certificates are particularly vulnerable to exploitation and forced labor and prostitution. It points out that young men and boys are forced by Zimbabwean government security forces to work in the diamond mines. It points out that women and girls from towns bordering South Africa and Zambia are forced into prostitution in brothels that cater to long-distance truck drivers, and it goes on to get into how severely exploited these women are, often contracting HIV/AIDS and other STDs. And then the point is, officials made no apparent efforts to proactively identify victims of trafficking. There have been no reports, according to the TIP report, of prosecutions or convictions for forced labor or forced prostitution. And even in 2009, 7 Zimbabwean men who were recruited in Zimbabwe by a Chinese national for jobs, once they got to their destination, their passports were confiscated and they were subjected to forced labor. And again, the TIP report reads like an indictment. Your views on what needs to be done? Yes, we want to obviously create better institutions of government, but here's a mirror that has been held up with our minimum standards in our law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and Zimbabwe's people, especially its women and children, are being exploited cruelly. Secondly, on the issue of religious freedom, on November 17th, the new Religious Freedom Report came out and pointed out that the government harassed religious leaders who were critical of government policies, who spoke out against human rights abuses committed by the government, and who provided humanitarian assistance to citizens. It seems to me like in every other government or that we hope will matriculate from dictatorship to a true thriving democracy, the the faith community plays a key role in the cruelty that's being visited upon clergy and faith individuals who speak out. I would appreciate your views on that. And finally, you mentioned, Dr. Tupi, the Chinese prisoners from that you reported upon. Were they from Chinese gulags brought in from China? Is that what you were talking about? And where does the wealth gleaned from the diamonds go? Does it go to Swiss bank accounts? Do we have any sense as to how that money is tracked as the colonels and the generals rip off their own people who don't benefit from the diamond mines, for example, because it goes into their bank accounts?
Shall I start with the last question? The story of Zimbabwean prisoners working in the mines is well established. In terms of the Chinese prisoners, these are anecdotal stories that I heard from Zimbabweans, many of them former farm owners or laborers whom I contacted in the last say few months. Obviously, those are, as I said, anecdotal stories. These would be, all I was told, these are Chinese prisoners who are working there. I do not know whether these are political prisoners or prisoners who are in prison for
But they are from China.
But they are Chinese, yes. The Chinese have a long established practice of importing their own labor into African countries. In many other circumstances, instances like the one in Zambia, for example, the Chinese laborers seem to be free individuals who do so willingly. Not so in Zimbabwe, where we seem to have a forced labor, or if you will, slave labor. I do not know specifically about gold. I do know that diamonds are exported out of Zimbabwe legally. Because the country is allowed to do so under the Kimberley process, of which the United States is a part and perhaps could wield some influence there. And obviously the companies that do so are very tightly connected to either the Russian or the South African governments. We all know about the interaction between the South African government, the ANC government, and the ZANU-PF, so it is not difficult to imagine that there is a deal whereby some of the proceeds find themselves flowing back into the country, specifically to the Zimbabwean military and the top echelons of the ZANU-PF.
Thank you, Chairman. I will just add on the diamond sector. The national budget presented to Parliament last week indicated that the proceeds from diamonds was 41 million US dollars, with about 8 million which was still supposed to be remitted. Now, if you look at the analysis that was done on the diamond sector, Zimbabwe is supposed to get at least 2 billion annually from its diamonds, in addition to the natural resources sector. So clearly there is a shortchanging that is going on because the diamond sector is not subjected to the extractive industries transparency initiatives or other processes that are enhancing revenue collection to finance development imperatives in the country. So we'll continue to be plagued and in fact threatened by the problems of the resource curse, where the richness of the country is starting to become a curse, unless there is a greater transparency on that front. On the trafficking person question, I think it mirrors the fact that Zimbabwe's development indicators have declined dramatically, with an unemployment rate of 90%, with a poverty level of 95%, moving from 62% in 1995. Clearly the options for survival are diminishing, and people become vulnerable to sharks and other people who are dealing in persons. And I think none but renewal of political institutions of government, effective policing, and employment creation will stop the process that we have described. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to add on to what Mr. Mchena has commented on the issue of diamonds, I think the issue that most of even these sales are now held in private is actually acted as a cover. And that's one, in a way, where you actually call these sanctions busting measures are actually, because most of these companies may be surprised their identity is not being exposed for the simple reason that some of these companies may actually be coming from countries which has exposed restrictive measures also on Zimbabwe in terms of doing business. So the issue of the involvement of these the lack of a sort of a cohesive approach on how these measures which are in place are being implemented is actually a sort of trip down to the issues of the sale of diamonds in terms of transparency. And to the extension that this is actually provided a war chest for ZANU-PF in the upcoming elections, that they feel emboldened, that most of the claims, they're actually, most of the other side of the government, like the ministers, I think even the finance minister, even the prime minister himself, he does not have the first-hand sort of understanding of how the operations at the Marange Diamonds are being conducted. And this has actually given an avenue to actually, to ZANU-PF to actually build its war chest, ready to face the election head-on, pull a result, and then negotiate thereafter. So actually, you can actually see the issue of that the diamonds have actually become like the weapon, which actually is going to determine the political dynamics in the next 6 months. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith, in terms of your questions 1 and 2, I absolutely share your abhorrence of that situation that you've described. And I think that whatever policy prescriptions we explore in terms of existing legislation and how we move into the future here has got to take that into account. We all know, I've worked in conflicted countries throughout Africa, we all know that human trafficking and the denial of religious freedoms are often a result of failed societies, of the loss of the normal sanctions of society, the destruction of family, the undercutting of the moral authority of church, of school, of the destruction of local governance. It's not just criminal, well, it's criminal elements, but they are able to feed on destruction of society, and it's an awful thing. It's happening in other countries throughout Africa and throughout the world. It's something that I'm very glad you mentioned, I think needs to be focused on in terms of the recovery of this society. We talk about renewal in quotation marks. There's no renewal if we don't address this question.
Thank you. What we're going to do is I'd like to ask Ms. Woolsey if she would ask her questions and the panel to think of the answer to hers. Would ask Mr. Flake if he would also ask his questions before the answer. The members, they will have the right to leave when they feel it's appropriate. We only have 4 minutes left. However, there are over 370 members who have not voted yet, which is the key number. So we'll leave it up to them. I usually stay longer than most, but I used to be fast. Ms. Woolsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, all of you, here's my question. Through the lens of the people of Zimbabwe, have there been any improvements over the last 18 months or 10 years in general? And if so, who's led those improvements or who have impeded those improvements? And how vulnerable are the programs themselves, and how vulnerable are the providers of those programs? And let's use healthcare, if you will, as our example. Healthcare, maternal health care, HIV/AIDS, cholera. What's happening with those concerns, and how are they being treated, and how best can we, meaning the United States, the UN, the AU, get Zimbabwe healthy again?
Thank you. Mr. Flake?
Almost sneezed there, sorry. I was going to actually follow up on some of the questions with regard to mining and really the dynamic between finance ministry in control, by the opposition, and the military and control and seemingly funded back through. But I mean, if we're, I think that the budget that was introduced last week, 2.7 million, it was indicated by the finance minister that that represented all domestic revenue sources, not aid from the outside. How true is that? Is mining, you mentioned it could be as high as $2 billion. That's an annual figure that it could be, and we're only capturing 40 million or so there. Is it assumed that that amount is being plowed back into the military or that kind of infrastructure? And if so, how in the world can you go into an election season satisfying the strictures that have been laid out in terms of ensuring that it's free or fair when you have that kind of money plowed back into the security structure that's controlled by Mugabe or ZANU-PF? So anyway, those were the kind of answers or the questions that I was going to ask. I'll be satisfied with that after we come back, I guess.
Yes, no, gentlemen, you may answer any way you like.
I will try to answer, first of all, Congressman Flake. Reports that I have seen suggest that hundreds of millions of dollars annually are being plowed back into the military and to the top party members, and also to the police force. Both of these, the military and the police, will obviously be absolutely vital. Their behavior will be vital in terms of whether the election will be free or fair. And in answer to your second question, no, I don't believe that the election under these circumstances can be free and fair, especially if the threat of violence by the repressive state apparatus is going to hang over the opposition as the sword of Damocles. And to you, Congresswoman Woolsey, apologies. The improvements in terms of healthcare and welfare in general in Zimbabwe happened because of simply the ability and the willingness of the Zimbabwean people to basically take care of themselves. They were prohibited from doing so by hyperinflation, which ran to trillions of percent, and also by political violence. Once hyperinflation was subdued and they were able to deal in a normal currency such as the US dollar and the South African rand, and once political violence subsided, people returned to what they do best, which is to improve their lot. And so we are seeing gradual increases in welfare in Zimbabwe, and I would expect those to continue until the political situation doesn't become unbearable again.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would start by answering Congresswoman Woolsey's questions. I think that there's been a lot of improvement. I think that's what we started by saying, that there's been dramatic improvements in the 2 years since the global political agreement was consummated, and specifically on the sectors that you talked about, health, education. Keep in mind that Zimbabwe has a proud investment record in education and health on the continent with leading indices up until 2000, and the country started to dramatically collapse. But in the last year alone, all schools that had been closed in 2007, 2008 were opened, which was good. We also had health sector opening up, and we also had cholera, which had been totally eliminated, which had become the scourge. So there's been improvements. These improvements are now being affected by the threat to the return of the old order. I think that's the point we're making. In terms of the economy, the mining sector, the total contribution of the mining sector to the budget was 44%. And that not only includes diamonds, it also includes gold, platinum, and so on. And as a result of the restoration of stability, we started to see profits in the mining sector. So what needs to actually happen is a much more predictable economic management system and economic governance system to fully exploit the opportunity of a buoyant mining sector in Zimbabwe, which can actually finance the budget. The reason why Minister Biti could not rely on foreign donors coming in with the budget was because the vote of credit was expected to be at 800 million. They've only mobilized 200 in the last year. So he decided, no, let's go it alone. This is why I'm saying 60% of the resolution of the Zimbabwean crisis can be done domestically through reforming laws, political reforms, and so on. And the international community can accompany that progress. And I think part of the record is being indicated in the Ministry of Finance conduct, including ensuring that the governor of the central bank is quarantined to a more central governor's role than what he has been doing in the last couple of years. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Just to keep on briefly to what Mr. Mchena said, I think the generality of the people of Zimbabwe have really seen the benefits of the inclusive government in the past 18 months. To an extent, this is the feeling which is driving the general dislike of for a premature call for an election. For the people who wanted this inclusive government to be sustained for a period of maybe for the next 2 years or so, to allow the green shoots, which were even happening, even on the economic front, to actually to be sustained. Equally, we've seen fast improvement in education, in terms of schools, textbooks, and all in the context of the humanitarian plus extended, especially at the onset of the inclusive government. And I believe this is what actually, when people look at it, the next election coming, the fears are for a relapse to the pre-March 2008, where the shops were empty, food, and right now, there's a growing fear that if this election talk reaches a crescendo after the new year, we are actually going to see a situation where there will be a fast deterioration of the small capital flight which was in, going out, shortages of food because of political instability. No wonder why, is what we've been restating on this panel, that what needs to be done in the next 6 months in terms of doing a course correction, in terms of engaging with South Africa and SADC, should go to a very large extent to answer, is Zimbabwe ready for an election? And I think this should be looked in the whole context of the reforms and the need to have the country to heal before any other election can be held. Thank you.
Thank you. You have a quick response.
Yeah, to Congresswoman Woolsey's question. First of all, when you asked it, you said, has there been any improvements in the last 10 years and the last 18 months? Very, very important to keep those timeframes in mind, because in the last 10 years, absolutely not. In the last 18 months, yes. And it's not coincidental, and it's been mentioned that that is coinciding with the September 2008 GPA and the formulation of the coalition government. You asked who and how any improvements, if they've taken place, have come about. In these last 3 years or so, approximate 3 years since the GPA, there has been an increased flow of foreign aid, around $800 million a year, and that has been very targeted, not through government, very targeted in health, education, water, sanitation. So it really has has been of great assistance, I believe, and created the situation of improvement. The Ministry of Finance has already been discussed. I won't reiterate it. Attacking the inflation problem, attacking the, decoupling the currency and going back to a U.S. dollar basis has really helped. But what Dr. Tupi said is very important, that people are resilient, and I think what you're seeing here is also reflected in their hope for the future. Not just their resilience and relying on themselves and getting by and getting through, but because they see hope for the future, there is a renewed spirit. Obviously, that hope can be dashed very easily if the coalition government doesn't work, if the elections don't come about, Constitution isn't put in place. But I think we're seeing that rising aspirations now as people are hopeful that things may come right.
Well, let me certainly thank the panel. Unfortunately, we are going to have to leave in a minute, but I also agree that I think Zimbabwe has a great future if we can get over this hurdle. The next 6 months are important if we can move to a new Zimbabwe. Let me ask for unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks. Without objection, so ordered. Once again, let me thank the witnesses for being here. It is my hope that H.R. 5971 will be seriously considered and that the U.S. policy will take full advantage of the window of opportunity in Zimbabwe. Thank you all again for your testimony, and the meeting stands adjourned.
Going to catch him before he got away, but he got away too quick.
Jennings Randolph Fellows of QSIP.
Oh, yes, sure.
And I'm working on Zimbabwe.
Oh, are you? Okay.
Yeah. So I thought we might at some point have a further conversation. But,
Work very closely with many of your colleagues over there, including past Ginny Randolph Fellows. When did that be? How long have you been there?
just since October.
And then where are you coming from? What's your background?
Well, I'm originally from Zimbabwe.
Oh, are you?
Yeah, but I've been in this country for 30 years.
Yeah.
I teach at Michigan State,
Yeah.
political science.
So you know David Wiley out there?
Oh, I do.
Yes.
And, I've actually